My name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I am so glad to welcome you to today's user share with Mike Nelson and Andrew Wood. They are going to be talking about Microsoft containers in a Citrix world, and if you weren't at Synergy and missed their session, this is your chance to hear it, ask questions, and just hear an updated version actually live just for CUGC today. Really quickly, I will go over, sorry, I get tongue-tied sometimes. The CUGC is growing vastly. We are over 16,000 members globally. We have 60 local groups and special interest groups. So if you haven't been out to mycugc.org lately, come out and find your local group and get involved. We have lots of webinar content, blog posts, and forums, lots of things for you guys to check out. And with that, just a couple housekeeping details. We are recording today's presentation, and you will receive a link to the recording tomorrow and an email from GoToWebinar. And also remind you that if you do have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question panel in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will keep an eye on those throughout the presentation. And with that, I will turn things over to Andrew Wood and Mike Nelson to get us started, and hopefully they won't get tongue-tied like I did. Here you go, guys.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. The first thing I have to ask is that if I could just see a show of hands, please, how many people are actually, I'm sorry, we're not, this is actually a webinar, isn't it, Andy?
Hopefully. I can take off the little sticker over my video link if you like, but let's do it as radio, shall we? I've got a better face for radio than I have for video.
And speaking of faces for radio, this is one on your screen right now. My name is Mike Nelson. I am actually a cloud architect. I have a whole bunch of community stuff that I do, and obviously I'm awarded graciously for that, and I appreciate that. You can always reach me at nelmedia on Twitter, and I also supplied my email address, nelmedia@gmail.com, in case you want to get a hold of me. Now, this next person coming up, this is a guy who is an unbelievable personality, and he has a face for television, no doubt. Look at this. This is just.
There we go. Do you want to press it? Do you want to press it? Andy Wood does nothing. There you go. There we go. So I'm an independent consultant. My name's Andrew Wood. Pleased to see your names in the attendee list again. If you've not met me before, then pleased to virtually meet you. Just like Mike, I'm a Citrix technology professional, CTP, VMware vExpert, chartered engineer, chartered IT professional. If you want to get in touch with me, at Andy M. Wood is my new Twitter handle. At Gilwoods, yes, if you're a bit old school, still works, but at Andy M. Wood is the one I pay more attention to. And you can check out blogs and other interesting stuff that I've been doing on my website, which I put there for your delectation.
That's great. That's awesome. What we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about Windows and Docker. We're going to be going through a little bit about Windows containers, and now with Windows containers, as not in previous versions of the early builds of Server 2016. Now it is controlled by Docker. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. We'll be talking about containers in Citrix and how that comes together in terms of working with the Citrix products, working with what we call the control plane, and also what we think is possible, not possible, and what the future might bring. Then we also have some alternatives we'd like to go through as well. And this is all to help you better understand containers, how they're used, how they can be used, and how they could help benefit your environment. So let's start off. This is actually a proposed logo to Microsoft for their new Windows containers logo. And if you notice, it's got the building blocks of the Windows colors, which represent containers on top of, if you're not familiar with the Docker whale. So they got the water underneath it. So it's kind of interesting, a play on the logo for Microsoft, but Windows containers are here to stay. There's something that Microsoft has dedicated a complete product team to, that product team is laser focused on bringing containers up to speed on the Windows platform. Now, that doesn't mean that they're just going to be Windows containers per se, but they very well could be a combination of both Linux and Windows containers, because as some of you know, Linux was the actual birth of the container way back in the early 70s. So with that, so Andy, I think we have to ask this question.
Why are you here? We're gonna rein it in from massive existential debates. If you just pop up the words, I think that'd be handy, and then that will also be as a trigger to me to stop trying to mess about with the UK Citrix user group Eventbrite page, which is what I was trying to sneak in there, evidencing the fact that I cannot multitask at all. So why are you here? So there's a good number of you, and maybe there's a future you looking at this from Friday or well off into the future with your rocket cars and whatever, asking, you know, what is the purpose of this particular presentation with me and what it is that I do? Are you in DevOps? Maybe you're a DevOps person, you've come into our virtual room to possibly understand what all this Citrix malarkey is. Or maybe you're an IT professional and maybe well be thinking, well, what's all this container malarkey? Ultimately, what we're hoping to give you with this topic is how can you make your IT service better able to deliver to the business. Now, I think we'd all agree automated delivery is the easiest way to rebuild. It makes it more straightforward in understanding the flow of changes, makes troubleshooting easier. It's best when you have a process flow where you know what the changes that you're proposing to do are going to impact the environment, because that's going to prevent errors. Yeah? Ultimately, let's get you to a point where any new or update or fixed feature being introduced can be introduced as seamlessly as possible. So that's a big goal, and then how can containers, quote unquote, help in automating that environment? Now, if you've come for specific insight into DevOps enablement for application delivery or deeply immersive videos in containers, then that'll be a slightly different session that Mike has not quite written yet. But hopefully there'll be definitely something interesting here where we talk about VMs versus containers. We're going to look at Microsoft's implementation of Docker, and then how that all sort of impacts in a Citrix environment. Hopefully you'll come out with how containerization can be useful within a Citrix stack. And when I say a Citrix stack, well, we're going to cover sort of Zen app, Zen desktop, delivering that sort of core piece, and then talk about Netscaler, talk about Zen Server and the application delivery piece there. Ideally with a modicum of dazzle, because ultimately what we're hoping to do here is entertain and educate.
Yes, yes. Andy is definitely the entertainment. No, so the first thing
Here's a quote, a dance monkey. All right, yeah.
So one of the first questions that we get all the time, and this is even going back we presented this obviously at Synergy, the same topic. We've obviously upgraded and improved it and added more content to it. But one of the questions that I get all the time is, what is the difference between a VM and containers? Now, this is not like something new or something that a thousand other people haven't talked about. But I always try and explain it in the simplest terms that I learned from one of the product managers at Docker. And when you think about it, when you look at a VM is like a house, okay? And the reason for that is because everything is self-contained within that house. All the plumbing, all the water, all the electricity, everything flows into that house, flows out of that house, but everything is enclosed within the walls of that home. Now think of that from a virtual machine standpoint. It's the same thing. So in a virtual machine, you have your networking, you have all your drivers, you have your kernel, you have the applications all sitting within the four walls, per se, of a house, okay? But when you talk about containers, you have to think about it a little bit differently. Containers are actually more like an apartment building. And the reason for that is because an apartment building obviously offers many living spaces within 4 walls of the apartment building, right? Now, that doesn't add on the pool area, which obviously, you know, that's a little extra. But when you think about the container, you think about it as you all share the same structure. So when you go back and talk about the fundamentals of the house or the VM, you talk about the plumbing, the electricity, you know, the heating, the cooling, things like that. Well, in an apartment complex, they all share those resources, right? And those are the core resources. From a container perspective, they share those resources. They bring them each into their own little 4 walls, inside of their 4 walls, okay? And they use those resources for whatever purpose they need to use, obviously to live there, to raise a family, to do whatever. In a container aspect, to run an application, okay? So if you think of it that way, it makes it a little bit easier to understand. One of the things that I also get is, will containers replace VMs? One of the questions that always comes up is, containers are cool, but do you think they'll really replace VMs? The answer flat out is no. Okay, that's not even the philosophical foundation for containers. It's not even close to what a virtual machine is. So really, in no way will containers ever replace virtual machines from that standpoint. Containers are not a virtualization technology, plain and simple. They really are not a virtualization technology. What they are is an application deployment and delivery technology. So containers are specifically created to deliver some sort of application or service. So if you have a service like what they call microservices, okay, if anybody's familiar with that, you can create microservices, or there are actually microservices out there today that could be utilized, like, you know, DNS, DHCP, things like that. They are created to deploy those services, to provide those services or provide applications, different types of application, websites, you know, written Java applications, just about anything a developer wants to put inside of a container. Okay, that's what they're there for. Okay, they're not there to run and house multiple applications like a VM is. All right, so on a VM, you can stack applications until you're blue in the face or until the VM runs out of resources. A container isn't built for that. A container is built to be lean, mean, fast, and easy. Okay, and that is the key right there.
Indeed.
So we're going to take a look at exactly what I just said. When you think about from a virtualization standpoint, you have your infrastructure, you have the host OS, okay, which could be what? It could be Zen Server, it could be Hyper-V, it could be VMware, laying on top of the hypervisor. Okay, the hypervisor is obviously part of the host OS, or it can be, those two could be, you know, coexistent. They could be the same thing. Then you have the guest OS, which can be Linux, Windows, and maybe down the road some other variations. But then you have your binaries and libraries and your applications all running on top of that guest OS. That is the basic premise of what a VM is today. When you look at containers, you have the infrastructure, the operating system, which you have to have some kind of operating system layer there, and then you have what's called the Docker engine, or the container engine. It doesn't necessarily have to be Docker, but in our scenario today that we're talking about, for our purposes, we're talking about the Docker container because we're talking about Windows containers. Now, there are other container technologies that are out there. You know, if you've ever heard of Rocket, you've ever heard of Rancher, you've ever heard of some of these other ones, there are other ones out there. But what we're talking about is we're talking about Docker, which is by and far the most widely used on the planet. When you on top of the Docker engine, then you have the binaries and libraries, and then the app. You notice there's no guest OS. Okay, there's nothing, because all the binaries and libs are being taken from the operating system, directly from the operating system, and they're being put into the containers. Okay, so if we look at a Microsoft view of containers, Microsoft pictures them like this. Microsoft says, okay, traditional machine, again, the application, the OS, hardware layer underneath, and then each VM. All right? If you take a look at containers, it's saying, okay, you got the hardware layer, but inside of the OS layer, we're going to throw the applications and the kernel all in there together. and then the containers are going to share those resources off the kernel. All right. So when a container starts up, it says, "Hey, kernel, I need these certain libraries and binaries and DLLs and things to run. I need that for my application to be successful in running. I need those from you," and the kernel delivers them. Okay. Now, if you take a look at it from this Windows Server containers standpoint, it delivers maximum speed and density. And why is that? Because you have the kernel that's being shared. Okay, the resources from the kernels are being brought up into the container, and the container itself is executing that at lightning fast speed. It has nothing else to do. It doesn't have to worry about any processes that are running in the background, anything else that would be causing latency or causing problems with disk I/O and all that other kind of stuff. All it's concerned about is running that application as fast and as quickly or as efficiently as it can. That's what it's concerned about. When you look at Hyper-V containers, take it a little bit step further. Okay, Hyper-V containers actually give you isolation plus performance. So what Hyper-V containers is the ability to actually take the container and place it directly on the Hyper-V hypervisor. All right. Now there are other competitors out there like VMware. Okay, so VMware has Photon. You have the ability to take Photon and be able to drop it right directly on top of the, that is actually, Photon is actually the, part of the vSphere or the ESXi hypervisor. Hyper-V is the same way. So containers natively can go directly on top of the Hyper-V hypervisor and run, okay, with individual kernels being put into their own containers, which means you are really creating that barrier of security around that container, all right, because it has its own binaries and its own libraries, and it doesn't need to go talk to anything else. It's completely isolated. Okay, so that gives you even more for the security conscious folks out there and the people that are worried about compliance and worried about, leakage, things like that. I'm not going to say that it's the end-all be-all and that it's 100% effective, but it is more secure than just running containers on their own. And the key thing to remember here is that Windows containers, it's all about the user mode. Now, I'm not sure if you remember when you first started learning about Windows, you learned about two different modes inside of the Windows kernel, one or inside of Windows, the operating system. There was user mode and there's kernel mode. Okay, everybody knows kind of like what kernel mode does, right? So kernel mode is the drivers, it's the hardware, it's the HAL, it's the ability to communicate with that hardware and deliver input and output from that hardware. All right. When you talk about user mode, okay, that's when you start getting into things like the local security, the session manager, and then in the container world, Docker Engine and the compute services. Those all run within a user context, not within the kernel context, but within a user context. And the Windows Server container does the same thing, system processes and application processes that ride on top of the kernel, but they're all in the user mode. Now, a virtual machine, again, going back to the Hyper-V, you are still talking about, the user mode, but that's specifically tuned in the Windows world. It's specifically tuned to run as a container in that user mode. So Microsoft has gone to great lengths, I mean, unbelievably great lengths to work with Docker and make sure that this thing runs as smoothly as it possibly can. They actually put a lot of effort into it before they focused on Docker. They actually created their own containers with the help of Docker, but it really wasn't Docker. And then they actually went all in on Docker. So they've really focused on this, and this is a big deal when you're talking about machine isolation, container isolation, application isolation, and security. So when you get Windows Server and Hyper-V containers mix, this is a slide that I created that's kind of cool, but at the same time it's kind of a little bit hard. I'm just going to get right to the point here. If you look at this, this is actually outlining all the different scenarios that you could run containers on top of a Windows operating system. Okay, so from a physical Azure platform, an Azure platform, or an Azure Stack platform. Okay, you can run Hyper-V on top of that, and then on top of that, Server 2016. If you notice on the left-hand side, you can actually run physical Azure Stack, but then Server 2016 creeps in there without Hyper-V. But if you can go from the bottom up, you can see what the possibilities are. You can run Linux containers on top of Server 2016. Coming down the pipe here, you're actually going to be able to do more. I can tell you right now that I don't know if you're familiar, but there's something called coming out called RS3, a version of 2016, which is the third edition of Redstone. That will actually contain even more Linux subsystems to it. So Linux and Windows are finally coming together in this really happy relationship inside the Microsoft world, which is really, really cool and beneficial to all the folks that have had to run, separate environments and had to deal with two different types of administration and things like that. So it's really a good thing, and some people are balking at it, especially the folks that have done Linux for a long time. They're like, ooh, Windows, we hate Windows, we don't want you to touch Windows. But at the same time, if you come up with a management platform, whether it be a GUI platform or a CLI like PowerShell, and be able to manage those through a single, I don't want to say pane of glass, because that's utopia, but if you had the ability to manage them on a common platform, then that makes everybody's lives a lot easier. It really does. And this slide right here kind of explains that a little bit on how you can run those and have those coexist. And if you'll notice, one thing on here is you can actually run it with Windows 10 as well, which I'm going to show here in a second. Now, Hyper-V has different OS releases and builds, right? Server OS has a release version must be the same, while build versions can be different. So what that means is, if you run containers on Hyper-V, you can run different OS releases and build. Okay, you can run a Linux version, kernel version X on a Hyper-V that the OS, obviously is a Hyper-V. You can mix the Windows versions together, so on and so forth. But if you run it directly on the server OS, so you say you took the physical and then you put Server 2016 on it, okay, the release version must be the same. The build version can be different, but the release version must be the same, or else the container won't execute, won't work. Okay, and I can show that to you real quickly here. If you actually tried to do that in PowerShell, okay, if you run Docker, and I'm running this on a Windows box, it actually comes up and says, you know what, image operating system Linux cannot be used on this platform. Okay, so it'll actually come back and tell you that. Now, it'll tell you that today, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that way tomorrow. And part of that reason is because if any of you had watched or looked at a conference called DockerCon, which happens every year, DockerCon 2017, they came out with a huge announcement, which is that Windows plus Docker plus something called the Linux Kit. Okay, now the Linux Kit is actually a secure, lean, and portable Linux subsystem. And what that does is it's developed by Docker now. Okay, this is in conjunction with Microsoft, but it's mainly a Docker thing. You can download it from Docker. And what it does is it gives you the ability to run that cross-platform. All right, now I tell you this, but I can also tell you that coming from Microsoft is going to be a native way to do that. So down the road here, they will most likely be a native way to run those cross-platform. Okay, but the Linux Kit gives you the tooling to build custom Linux subsystems. It's less than 35 meg in size. It's very quick to start, and all system services are containerized and can be removed or replaced. Okay, it'll most likely start as a feature of the Windows Server, and then it, in my visioning, in my hypothetical what could happen next world, it'll actually become part of the Windows OS. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here now is I'm actually going to show you. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm going to skip that. So what we have here is we have the Citrix relationship. Okay, and we added Microsoft. All right, and now we've added Docker. So when you bring those three together, okay, there are all kinds of possibilities. And the things we have to keep in mind, though, is when we're talking about this, is number one, this is all kind of brand new, right? It's, containers aren't brand new. Citrix and obviously Microsoft are not brand new. But the whole concept of them working together and the ability to piece them together and have them work in harmony is something new. So when we start talking about what you can actually run in this world, everything has to run on Windows Server Core, okay? Or it has to run on Nano Server. I don't know if you're familiar with Nano Server. I've given a few talks about it. I'm very passionate about Nano Server. Nano Server is also just changed. As a matter of fact, Microsoft has changed their direction. So Nano Server is actually going to be for containers, specifically for containers. Okay, so that is their focus on Nano Server. It's not going to just be an OS that you can run a very slim layer of OS and have it security hardened and so on and so forth. It's actually going to be for containers. And then you have Windows 10. So that's pretty much the only platforms that you can run this combination on. All right, so let's take a look at Docker on Windows. Okay, Server and Core and Nano Server only for now. Windows 10 for Dev Test. And I'm going to show you that in a second. This is a really cool thing that I want you to see. Management. Management is both. You have the built-in Docker CLI and also PowerShell. You also have some third parties. You have a Kitematic, which has been around forever, Portainer, Panamax, Simple Docker DUI, and Shipyard, which is a Linux platform. But all of those are available to manage the Docker container environment on Windows and Linux. And then you have the public or private hubs and registries. Now, Microsoft has actually created their own registry. If you're not familiar with what a registry is basically the ability to index a repository. A repository is a place to put all of your containers that people can use. So, and if you're familiar with the Docker Hub or the Docker Store, I think they call it the Docker Store now. The Docker Store is actually where they keep all the containers that you can download. If you look on there and you just search on Microsoft, you're going to find a whole bunch of containers that Microsoft created, including SQL. So SQL Server can be run in a container now, which is really, really cool. All right, so I'm going to show you this real quick. First, I'm going to, before I do, I'm going to say, some folks are going to say, well, how do I get, my stuff over to a container? How do I get it converted to a container? Well, you know what? There's no real easy way to do that unless it's just a core application. If it's a core, what they call a core application, it's kind of really easy to do. They have an actual PowerShell module called Image to Docker, okay, that'll port an existing Windows app, only the artifacts, from the VMs to the Docker images, okay? So you can run this module and you can take any of the apps that have artifacts that are IIS, ASP.NET, MySQL, SQL, Windows features, Apache, DHCP, DNSR, Microsoft message queuing, and be able to use this PowerShell module and just create a container right off of it and then run the container. Piece of cake. Really, it's that simple. It's a matter of whether or not the application is or fits inside of those artifacts that are supported is the question, because most applications do not. Okay, and when you get to that, you may have to come up with an alternative, and you'll get to that in a little bit. What I'm going to show you now is I'm going to do a real quick install demo for the Docker in Windows 10 and Server 2016. Okay, currently today, you can actually go out to the Docker for Windows site, okay, and you can actually download from the Docker store the Docker for Windows client. Okay, so we're going to go out and do that. And when you actually bring up this page, Docker CE, which is Community Edition, you can actually pick 3 different kinds. You can versions: the stable channel, the edge channel, or the edge for Windows Server 2016. All right, so when you download that and you do the installation, you'll notice this little whale that shows up in your taskbar. All right, that little whale icon. And if you right-click on that whale, you can see the options that are available to you. The about, the settings, check for updates, but look at this one. Switch to Windows containers. All right, so inside of this, you have the ability to switch between Windows and Linux containers on the fly just by right-clicking, which is really, really, really cool. The condition is you're running Windows 10, you have to be running Hyper-V on Windows 10. And what it does is it puts this little Moby Linux VM inside of your Hyper-V for the Linux, running the Linux containers. All right, running the Microsoft containers, it also creates a VM but you cannot see the VM. It's a hidden VM, and it's not one you can manage, okay? So it'll never show up. So even though I switched to Microsoft containers now, the Linux container will continue to run. And that it shuts down when your machine shuts down. It starts up. It's a tiny. I mean, look at it. It's just a tiny Linux box. It barely takes any resources. And if you actually run the Docker, you can see you have the full complement of Docker commands here that you can run. Now this is really cool for DevOps, right? And for developers that don't have VMs. They have the ability to run this right on their Windows 10 desktop. And this is really exciting stuff if you think about it. The ability to, if you create for Windows applications or Linux applications, or you're a system administrator and you want the ability to switch between the two, just right-click and switch. It's not that big of a deal. So from this point, I'm going to let Andy take over a little bit, and he's going to be talking about using the containers.
So I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Well, that's good. I was answering some questions that came up in the chat window, and I turned off the speaker, put myself on mute, and then thought, I'll tell you what I'll do. It'll come to my bit, and then there'll just be like 5 minutes of silence because I've forgotten to turn it on. So some questions have actually come through. So Mike's done a great job there of explaining what containers are and how they operate and how you can make use of them in Windows 10. And obviously your question now is, I know all about containers. How can I actually make use of them in a Citrix environment? How can I make use of them, say, in the control plane? Can I use containers to deliver the piece of the Citrix stack that actually enables me to make use of Zen app, Zen desktop instances? How can I make use of the desktop? Can I use containers to deliver the desktops? And then obviously within a Citrix environment, you are putting Zen app instances in, you're putting Zen-doc instances in order to deliver a desktop environment. But a desktop is useless without the applications that go with that desktop. Ultimately, what you're doing is providing access to applications and data. And there's been a couple of questions. Hemant, I think, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, wants to know how you can make use of containers to deliver applications easily, readily, in a way that can be reproduced, managed, and changed easily. Excellent, got your name right, spot on. We can just end now. It's all good. When you say switch to Windows, I'll let Mike answer Zach's question. So if we crack on, so that's the focus of this bit. Now, one of the key things that Mike mentioned when he talked about Docker support was it's for the server component. Yes, it's for, and although it does work in a Windows 10 environment, Windows containers relies on the user space isolation implemented in the kernel. Yes, we've covered all of that. But what it doesn't have is a GUI install interface. So if you've got a GUI application, you can't necessarily run it as a Docker, as a Microsoft container. Yeah. Now this isn't the case if you're delivering desktops via Citrix for Mac environments, for Linux environments, then you've not got this limitation. I wish I'd put on. I think I will. As a tweet later on. There's a nice blog from Jez Fraz, blog.jezfraz.com, where he talks about using a Linux desktop and making use of containers to manage applications and isolate applications in his Linux desktop. But you have not got that capability in a Microsoft environment. So you might be thinking, well, this whole next bit of the presentation is going to be a bit short, but we'll come on to how you can containers later on. Like, don't leave, good stuff is coming. But let's go back to this. So if there's no GUI, how does that affect sort of the whole Citrix environment, the control plane environment? If you would be so kind, Mike, as to sort of build out the control plane up to optional and then some apps in as well. Everything except the fancy URL where I introduce some nice stuff. So if we consider the control plane in a Citrix environment is how you manage that Citrix delivery piece. Yes, there'll be a license server, there'll probably be a director instance ideally. You've got your DDCs, Studio will be up and running somewhere. There'll be a SQL database holding all of this stuff. You'll have Netscaler, ideally you've got something like Netscaler in there in order to protect the edge and manage resources coming from externally into your environment or isolate within your own network, and you've got some storefront services. Now there's some ticks and there's some crosses. Ultimately, the a lot of the installation routines for all of these components rely on the Windows GUI environment. So trying to install them as a Docker container so that you could deploy them as containerized instances so that you could scale out very rapidly, very easily, just isn't possible. That's not the case of SQL. Microsoft have sorted out SQL. You can run SQL in containers. Mike, I think you had reference to at one point in time, you had a reference to a really nice demo showing SQL instances running, isolated instances, but you could run a number of different SQL services on the same host, so you could scale out your SQL very nicely using containers. That's a consideration for you. But in terms of the Citrix components, license server, directed EDC Studio, not today, given the requirement for GUI interaction, like the install routine doesn't work. Unless you frig about with it, unless you hack it. Julian Stanovich, I think, did an article where he messed about with the MSI installation routine and got license server to work in a container by removing the GUI elements that were required. But I'm not suggesting that is a supported way through. Ideally, Microsoft would be able to fix that particular component. If you wanted to scale out or manage it in a different way, or manage your control plane in a different way, then it's services. Well, it's automated services. So you're automating using PowerShell the installation of processes. You could probably look at desired state configuration in order to ensure a consistent build, but not containers today, unless you're managing your NetScaler environment. So NetScaler NetScaler has NetScaler CPX, which is a new version, a containerized microform of NetScaler. If I read out the notes, it's designed for cloud microservice applications as well as dev and test. Yeah, it acts as an app-to-app proxy, runs on the host, so in exactly the same sort of a similar way to as Mike's been explaining, because it's a container. But this is obviously a Linux environment rather than Microsoft, because NetScaler is Linux. Yeah. What it would allow you is your NetScaler CPX is thus and therefore portable across your Linux hosts, which should, in theory, ease deployment across those types of environments. I've got to admit, when I first thought about it, I thought, really, well, you're going to live like the dev people are going to be able to be in control of sort of like networking resources and firewalls. Surely that is a recipe for disaster. But then if we actually consider what a DevOps team is, it's not just engineers. There'll be whole teams of people who I would hope there'd be some networking security specialists in there. They can work together as a team in order to deliver an application that has its firewalls built in, and that can be scalable and movable around your environment. So an interesting concept, and there's a link shown on the page there, at a bit.ly link. I was at E2E VC event in Rome back end of last year, so experts to experts, www.e2evc.com, where Edwin and Henry did a really informative presentation on this technology. Back then, a little bit wobbly. I think I'll give it a due. It was quite new. Hopefully it's moved on. I know there are other E2EVC events in New York, Barcelona, so check out their agendas. There may be some updates on that. Obviously, there's the CUGC local events. Tap in to both the website and maybe have a look on that, where people are talking about the NetScaler CPX technology if you wanted to understand more. But right. NetScaler, then you might also consider, what about XenApp, what about Zen Desktop and the applications? Now, I have messed about with using, effectively I got a KVM instance and then containerized that, and in the KVM instance instantiated a Windows 2016 build and put XenApp VDA on it, and sort of got that to build. It was incredibly clunky. I wouldn't necessarily think it was great, and obviously it's not a contained container. You've had to put some, you have to wrap a KVM instance in order to make it truly portable. Not great, so I'm going to give crosses for both XenApp and Zen Desktop. And apps, yes, if I was considering, I've touched on it, if I was considering just Microsoft containers, no, not possible today, but there are alternatives, and we'll come on to what those alternatives are. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Mike. I know you're doing some sort of moonlighting, aren't you? You're actually in a CUGC event.
I'm actually giving a presentation at a user group meeting, and just an hour ago, and I've kind of hopped into a separate room here to cover this one. So I'm doing double duty today.
Yeah, all right then. Excellent. That is dedication to the. That's why you've got more awards than I have. So if we talk about applications, typically what you're probably doing today is you're probably using AppV, or you're probably using one of the layering technologies. Now, application virtualization, yes, can Docker containers replace all of that? As your man Mike Coleman says, it's not a direct replacement for AppVirt, but it could be. So potentially you've got AppV today, you're making use of it, because ultimately there's a common drive to ensure that applications can be readily introduced into a clean image, a non-persistent desktop. We've got AppVirt, like here, and then we've got layering technologies as well. So if we consider AppVirt, AppVirt also runs in a user space, so there's some restrictions on what it can run. It can't run AV, can't run VPN, boot stuff, kernel stuff, drivers, and so on. Yeah, AppVirt really good for application isolation, multiple runtime versions, streaming to non-persistent desktops, application compatibility. But there are some things that it cannot do. Yeah, as I say, the kernel stuff. Now we could replace that on next slide, or complement that, as it were, with some layering technologies. Mario Sambu's got a great blog talking about a comparison between application virtualization and application layering. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. And layering technology, so the layering technology, so obviously Citrix bought Unidesk, so that's now in product. You've got other people like FS Logix or Liquidware who have their own layering capabilities. And layering is handy because it helps with your application lifecycle management. It means that you can reduce your images in a similar way to AppVirt. But there are a wider range of applications that can be supported using this, just for the way that the filter driver that's in the layering technology works and brings new components in. So what about containers then? What about, can we use containers, given that the Microsoft ones don't support? If you click on to the next one. Now, out there today, yes, that's right, not Microsoft containers, but there is a company called Turbo.net. If you build it all out, Mike, because I realize there's lots of stuff. And to answer young Darren's questions, it's a bit late. Is this recorded? Yes, Darren, it's recorded. You'll be able to download this video. Obviously, we'll edit out all of the ers and the ums and the bit where Mike wandered off to go and do something else. That'll all be out. Nice and clear. So yes, you've got containers and Docker containers, but the container concept is not unique to Docker. Turbo.net, what was Spoon, if you have memories that long, has delivered a containerized technology that allows you to deliver applications. It's got a studio component so that you can effectively put applications into a package, and they've pre-packaged a range of applications that you can access directly, or you can create your own sort of like store to download them from. The teams over at XenAppBlog have done some neat stuff on that, and the omag.net has a nice deeper dive into what TurboNet does. And the nice people at TurboNet have said if you wander along on that URL at the bottom that you can download and get a pro account so you have a bit of a mess about. How does that interact and be useful to you with container technology is, we'll look at that in the next slide, which we've got a bit of a demo. I've got a bit of a demo. See if you click on it, it should auto start, or crash and burn horribly. Oh no, it's going to work. Lovely. So I have got my AWS instance. It could be the same on Azure or your own stuff. I've just used one that I can spin up nice and quickly, and I've logged onto the website where I can then download what it is that I need. This is just it's just a executable. It's just a client piece that you install into your desktop. Again, it's running in a user mode. Now, I'm not going to show you downloading a file and then installing it. I've already done this. This is effectively one I made earlier. Yeah, so I can then start up the TurboNet client, and you can see all of the commands that you can do. That's all lovely. I'm just going to do a version one, so if you're watching in the future, you can see the particular version that I'm using. What I'm going to do is use TurboNet to install some applications in this AWS instance just using TurboNet. So I'm going to create a new isolated instance of Firefox. Yeah, happy days. Firefox is already installed, but I want an earlier version. I want version 35. So I'm doing that similar functionality with AppV where I've got my application installed. So But potentially with that V, I've got all of the components in order to deliver the application. Here, I'm just downloading it straight from the interwebs, and I've got access to 35 as well as 54. So 54 is the one that's native in the environment, and here's the one that I've stood up as a containerized instance, and I can see that that's 35. Lovely. Now maybe I want to...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that container that you've just shown then is completely isolated from the other.
Yes, completely isolated from the other. All of the services are isolated too. Now, maybe I want to add some extra components in. One of the questions that Hannah asked is, how do I get pieces to interact? Now, the way that TurboNet works and the containers, you can add different components in. Here, I've added the Java runtime environment along with version 35. Version 54 gets a bit whingy about Java, so I'll go back to an earlier version, and here you can see that I'm going to activate the plugin, and I'll have access to version 8, I think. Or is it version 8? Yeah, version 8. But what happens if I know that my in-house web application needs an older version of Firefox, and it needs an older Java runtime environment, so I can specify that. And again, this is a complete isolated environment. So what I'll find is, when it starts up, is that all of the settings that I had previously, they've just been ignored because this is a different container with a different isolated environment. So I can start spinning up applications, multiple applications on the same operating system. I'm not spinning up VMs. So if you consider this as a testing bed for applications, I could spin up lots of individual applications using the same VM instance. So from an AWS or Azure cost perspective, I am making far better, far more efficient use of my resources. Here I am, I think, showing you the different versions. This should be version 7. Happy days. Now, the really nice thing about containers is that you can start to specify the environment that they run in. You can start to specify the amount of memory, the amount of CPU resources, or networking components that the container has access to. So you can a far more granular level of control than perhaps that you have with layering or perhaps that you have with AppVert. So here, I'm going to start with a Firefox instance. I'm going to block all IP and just allow access to my CUGC. So maybe I've got an internal application that needs an older version of a browser for whatever reason, and I want to make sure that my users can't accidentally use this instance to go off merrily and access the interweb and introduce a vulnerability. I just want them to access my site. So here I'm going to go to my CUGC, happy days, I'll be able to see 2 wonderful, beautiful faces and access the website. But if I try and go somewhere else, like I try and go to the BBC, I think I cock up the first one. Yes, I cock up the first one, so I couldn't connect to that anyway. But if I type the URL in correctly, I don't get access to it because I only allowed access to a particular website. And yet, if I use the full browser, the browser that's associated with the desktop, I can access the BBC if I want to. So that containerized, isolated instance, very fast to install, very easy to configure, but I've got a lot more control over the version of code that's in there, the pieces that are associated with it, the networking, and potentially the resource usage as well. And that's TurboNet's installation. If you read Marius's boil, I'd agree with him. I think that that delivery mechanism, using containers to deliver applications, is going to be something that is very useful to a number of organizations and will make application delivery simpler, not only for your virtual desktops, maybe in the cloud or maybe within your own organization, but across desktop types. So it's not just your virtual desktops, it's also your laptops, it's also your physical desktops, because that container technology can be used across the board. So you've got a consistent delivery mechanism. I wouldn't be surprised. I know TurboNet are currently alone in this space, but I wouldn't be surprised if the likes of Liquidware, if the likes of FSLogix and Citrix have a similar level of functionality in the future.
Well, and to be honest, I mean, I don't know if everybody remembers back in the days of the streaming, the published streaming.
Yep.
Back in XenApp days. So that was, I think, an early infant attempt at being able to deliver those applications like that, and now they've given up on that and said you should use AppV. I personally think that utilizing a technology like Turbo.net allows much more flexibility and being able to literally thousands of applications, but also hook up with their XenApp subscription, which allows you to actually publish those from a central console, publish those to the XenApp servers, and being able to, bring those to any receiver located anywhere. So it's really cool technology.
Yes, it is really cool technology. Does that mean that you throw away all of your App V stuff, throw away all of your layering stuff? No. There was a good question asked by Shri. Can they complement each other? Yes, they can. I think it was Rory during the week was talking about someone got 99.9% applications virtualized, but he used different technologies in order to achieve this. I think this just fits in another tool in your tool kit. I know that we've got 10 minutes and we've got one more slide, so we'll call that as time on application pieces. And then the last piece I'll add in is container support in Zen Server 7. So Zen Server 7 introduced container support for Windows in version 7. There was container support in 6.5 for Linux, for like Linux environments, but in version 7 you've actually got Windows support. So Zen Server has embraced, I'll cover that. Why would it be useful? Monitoring and visibility, so you can see which VMs are actually starting instances. If you press the button again, then that shows you a view of the VM instances that are going, I think, on the right-hand side. Mike, just press button again.
There it is, sorry.
Happy days, no worries. So monitoring visibility, you can see which VMs are used for Docker hosting, which containers are running. Diagnostics, you can see which ones are healthy, and you can use the Zen Center to start and stop containers. It's not a big, massive management piece. It's more, as James Bolton, who wrote the blog entry, will attest, it's more pets than cattle, but it is a start. So if you're looking to have containers in your Zen Server environment, you can manage them using Zen Center.
Awesome. All right, so like Andy said, we've got a few minutes left. We're going to do a summary here real quick. So what did we talk about, right? We talked about containers are not VMs, and they probably will never be. And I should have actually put the word probably there, but I'm pretty convinced they never will be. Containers are all about the user mode. You have to remember that as well. The Windows plus Linux kit equals a multi-platform. All right, that's one thing to remember moving forward, is that the Linux kit will allow that multi-platform to happen from the Docker side, and will eventually, in my crystal ball, will hopefully eventually get merged into the actual kernel of the Windows OS. There are OS and GUI limitations when you're dealing with containers. That's one thing you have to remember. Not like Andy just got done talking about, is not everything can be containerized. And if you throw, like you said, don't throw away your App B, don't throw away your layering. Look at other technologies. Look at Liquidware. Look at Turbo.net. Look at those other players and the emerging players in that field to see if they can supplement or even be able to take a bulk of your applications and be able to deliver them the way you need to have them delivered. Hyper-V for secure container isolation, and then use Windows 10 Docker for dev and test. It's fun to play around with. It really is, and it's something that if you ever wanted to just see how containers run, it's really cool. But if you ever want to actually create a container and be able to use it anywhere in the world, be able to move it anywhere in the world, and be able to start it up anywhere in the world, give it a shot. Have some fun with it. There are alternatives for delivering applications, which Andy just talked about brilliantly, by the way, and you should always investigate all those. And the final thing is Citrix. This is the note for Citrix. Citrix, you really need to support Server Core. You really need to take a look at your applications, your Zen app, your Zen desktop, your director, your storefront, your studio, all that kind of stuff. And you need to start looking at being able to put those applications on Server Core and not the full Windows GUI. The full Windows GUI in Microsoft's mindset going forward is kind of a thing that it's going, it's not going away. Don't ever think that it's ever going away, and I don't mean to, have you interpret what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that to be more secure, to be leaner, faster, and more efficient, you really want your applications to run on core. So I think Citrix should take that to heart and start looking at that as something that should be a focus in some of their future releases. So with that, Andy, do you have anything to add?
Yet again, demonstrating my inability to multitask. I was just looking down through the questions. In terms of adding on the summary, no. Hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully, if you were DevOps, then you've learned more about the Citrix malarkey, and if you were IT Ops, then you've learned more about the container malarkey, and that you've had some insight into how it is that you can move forward using this technology in order to help you deliver Citrix services or services to your business. I was just looking through the questions to see if there was anyone outstanding. I think we've answered most of them, other than Zach's, which is, when you switch to Windows containers or switch to Linux, does that mean you can only run one or the other at a time, Mike?
Yes, you can only run one at a time in that environment. You must switch back and forth. Now, what will happen is if you have a container that's running and you switch the container type in Docker, it'll actually suspend that container. Okay. Now, does that mean your application will continue to run? I don't know. It depends on the app, but it'll actually try and suspend that container, and then when you switch back, it'll try and spin it back up.
Right. Cool. Make more sense if I turn the mic back on, and let me just answer Jose's question there, who was asking, granted TurboNet have a large array of applications, but what happens if I've got my own? They like you have in AppV, like you have with all the layering technologies, you can introduce your own application and package it up into in this instance, a container. You can do exactly the same with TurboNet. Thanks very much. Thanks for the info. Okay, cool. Okay. So yes, and that's so yes, you can add in your own applications and have your own repository. So I'm in the example that I gave, I was downloading directly from the TurboNet site, but you can create your own internal sites that people would download applications from, so you can keep it all contained in a very similar way that you can have application stores in your AppV, or layering stores or resources if you've got the likes of Unidesk or FS Logics or Liquidline.
Right. Andy, I think we have to call it quits here.
I think we do.
Certainly appreciate everyone who joined the call. Andy, I can't say enough about my appreciation for having you join me and provide your expertise and entertainment as well.
Lovely. It's great that obviously when we did the session in Synergy, we got some great feedback from that, and lots of people attended, but it didn't get recorded. So it's nice to make use of the My CUGC services to put this as a webinar that people can make use of and watch it later, because yes, it has been recorded.
Yes. Stephanie, are you there?
I am here. So yes, thank you again to both of you. I really appreciate you guys doing this for CUGC. It was amazing and entertaining as always. Just a couple of quick notes for you guys. I put 2 links out in the chat window for everyone. The first is a link to the forum thread for this webinar. If you have more questions or want to send notes to Andy and Mike, you can do that there, and we'll make sure they see them. Also, like to ask you guys to fill out our survey. It's very quick, it's anonymous, and it just helps us plan future content, and just get feedback on the webinars. And with that, I will return you all to the rest of your day. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and Andy and Mike, and hope to see you guys all again at mycugc.org very soon.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Good evening. Good night.